Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
This week, the main message came from the Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili. He said Anaklia Port would be built with state participation. Several months ago, I instructed the Ministry of Economy and we are preparing a new tender. According to our decision, the port of Anaklia will be built with the participation of the state, where the state will own 51% and we will announce an international competition for the rest and select partner companies. This project is abandoned. The place is wrecked. Therefore, it is categorically unacceptable. We should urgently select international partner companies and we should also start investing in this project. This project will be implemented with our participation. The state will implement this project together with foreign or other companies, said the Prime Minister. Irakli Garibashvili added that previous investors, namely Anaklia Development Consortium, could not carry out the project and the state had to cancel the contract. He used some strong words and called the appeal of investors to the international arbitration as the case of robbery. Mamuka Khazaradze and Badri Japaridze invested only 3 million into the project. Some 27 million was invested by other investors, and now they want to rob citizens of Georgia, taxpayers of Georgia, and demand for the state to reimburse 1.5 billion. This is a sheer case of robbery, the Prime Minister stated on the government sitting this week. Shortly after, the Anaklia Development Consortium ADC issued the following statement in response to the 12 December 2022 comments by Prime Minister Garibashvili. In his speech to the government meeting today about the Anaklia Port project, Prime Minister Garibashvili made a series of misrepresentations about the Anaklia project and its past history. He also made assertions about the future of the project which are sure to fail. We would remind the Prime Minister that the dispute between the Anaklia Development Consortium and the government of Georgia is in arbitration at the International Chamber of Commerce in Geneva. He will be answerable for all his false statements today in that forum as well as before the Georgian public. ADC wishes to point out a few of the most dramatically false and misleading points in the Prime Minister's speech. The idea that the Georgian state can find a serious private investor for Anaklia Port while planning to take a 51% controlling interest in the project is absurd. It is the kind of corrupt and deluded privatization and concession process that was attempted in Georgia and the other former Soviet Union countries in the 1990s. It failed then, it was infused with gross corruption then, and the same would be true now. Moreover, no serious investor and no international financial institution will participate in or lend to a major project such as this if it is majority controlled by the Georgian state, especially given the Georgian state's demonstrated unreliability as a partner in numerous business cases. Second, it is quite clear that the government has failed completely in seeking out any legitimate investors or port operators willing to take on this project, given the existence of the arbitration claims along with the politicized Georgian judicial system, which this government has failed to reform. Third, it defies belief that the government will invest 300 million USD in the development of Anaklia Port in cash from the budget or other state funds when it refused to contribute even 50 million USD as a guarantee, not cash, to facilitate the financing of the construction of the port by ADC. Fourth, the idea that the Prime Minister wants the government to proceed with Anaklia urgently is obviously wrong. The government has sat on its hands for close to 3 years since terminating the Anaklia project. It even said in February 2020 it would announce plans for a tender within 2 weeks. The Prime Minister is speaking now only because of the release of an independent documentary on the project which unveils the deceit of the government in killing this project. Fifth, the tragedy of Anaklia, and here we mean especially the tragedy for the people of Anaklia village who have been left without jobs, with smashed hopes and with an environmental catastrophe in their front yards, is singularly the fault of the Georgian state, which stopped ADC from being able to finish the project that we started. The Georgian government has now owned, controlled and neglected the site for almost 3 years since they terminated the investment agreement with ADC. This government has not lifted a finger nor invested a tetri in the mitigation of the environmental problem they created by stopping the project, nor in the completion and development of civic infrastructure in Anaklia and its surrounding area, much less moving to resume construction of the port. Sixth, the Prime Minister's simulations announcement that he is stopping the development of a large port at Poti demonstrates by his own words the insincerity and absurdity of his statements about the government's plans to develop Anaklia. As the Prime Minister knows very well, it has been the government's continued encouragement of the potential development of a deep water port at Poti that has been one of the major obstacles to banks and private investors in financing the construction of a larger deep water port at Anaklia. Of course, the Prime Minister is in a difficult position on this subject, as the Pandora Papers proved that the Georgian Dream Party leader, Mr. Ivanishvili, has long held a business interest in the development of the Poti Free Industrial Zone, which depends on the development and expansion of Poti Port. So he is trying to walk a fine line between pretending to encourage the development of Anaklia Port while not alienating his party leader and other oligarchic interests with stakes in the development of Poti Port. Seventh, as confirmed by the Ministry of Economy and Sustainable Development's own audit, the amount of ADC's investment was 75 million USD and indeed higher, which 40 million came from Messrs. Khazaradze and Japaridze, not 3 million as claimed by the Prime Minister. Lastly, as the Prime Minister should also well know, ADC has sought continuously to achieve a negotiated solution to the legal dispute over Anaklia Port. Filing an arbitration case was a last resort for Anaklia Development Consortium and its shareholders, forced upon us and them by the government's determined opposition to letting ADC finish building the project and to its efforts to bring in other investors and banks for financing it. ADC's demand for damages in the arbitration case are necessary for it to protect its and its shareholders' legal rights, but the Georgian government, well known that it can settle the matter without spending a penny from the state budget, where it can negotiate reasonably and in good faith with ADC to secure the investment and financing needed to finish the Anaklia Deepwater Port project. Ninth, our desire is to see the Anaklia Port developed, plain and simple. This latest scheme from the government has no chance of success, and we think the government knows this. It's another case of the government stalling and wanting to blame others for its failure. The statement of Anaklia Development Consortium reads. Ted Jonas, member of the supervisory board of the ADC, talked about the case in detail with BMG's TV's program Business Course. Here are some main points from the interview.
You know, I've been involved in Georgia for a very long time, and I first came here in 1994, and in 1996 I started practicing business law with Georgian partners. And one of the early transactions that we did in the late 90s was a privatization where the state kept 51%, and there was a sale of 49% of the shares. This was a typical method in the 1990s. It's a typical method used by the Russian government when the state wants to maintain control. Especially in Georgia, I'm not aware of any other case where it was tried after Zestafoni ferroalloy in the late 1990s, which was a very ugly and I would say probably corrupt situation. So it is essentially an archaic idea, and one that was corrupt and failed when it was used a lot in the 1990s. And today, of course, in a more modern world, that is only more true. No reputable international investor, and by that I mean a public company, whether Western or not Western, but a company that has listed shares, a company that has bonds, no international bank, no international financial institution is going to participate in a project that is dominated and controlled by a 51% state interest. That is simply a matter of investor preference. But then secondly, you have the unfortunately bad reputation of the Georgian government as a partner. And so I can tell you, as someone who practiced law in this country for a long time, I would never advise a foreign investor to do a deal in this country as a minority shareholder in a majority state-owned company unless there were massive protections for their security, which would partly require them, I would say, to be an international public company. The only investor who would come in a case where the state owns 51% and the private investor will own 49% is going to be, I'm sorry to say, some sort of non-transparent oligarch, or perhaps a state fund from one of the countries that's not democratic and is not transparent in its actions. So the whole idea of Anaklia Port, of bringing in European investors, American investors, reputable, publicly listed Eastern investors from Central Asia or China, is destroyed by this plan of having a 51% controlling state interest. Of course, this is enormously ironic, is that the state still to this day, and Mr. Garibashvili in his statement yesterday, complains that, he says Anaklia Development or Khazaradze, but that's not true. The international financial institutions, EBRD, Asian Development Bank, OPIC, Asian Industrial Development Bank, said, it wasn't us, they said there needs to be some sort of guarantee on this project. Whoever provides it, there has to be a guarantee. That had been negotiated between the parties to where there was a pretty good idea on the table that a guarantee of $150 to $200 million would be acceptable, of which the European Union was offering to provide 50 to 75 million. Khazaradze and Japaridze, from their own resources, were offering to provide as a parent guarantee 50 to 75 million. And the only thing that was being asked of the Georgian government was to match it, 50 to 75 million. That would be their part, and not cash. This is a guarantee, which is a conditional liability. And now Garibashvili comes out yesterday and says that the state is going to be a 51% owner and developer of this project, which will require the state to invest at least $300 million in cash. Now, if they're willing to invest $300 million in cash in the project, which, by the way, doesn't even include their obligations to build roads and railroads and all the other infrastructure that they have to do, why on earth were they not willing to do a $50 to $75 million guarantee, which doesn't even require any money out of the state budget unless and until the small chance contingency occurs that the guarantee has to be drawn upon? So, and also note the fact that 2 years ago, I said, I don't see them conducting a tender, and yeah, it was exactly correct. Here we are 2 years later, and there's been no tender. Not only that, it's been almost 3 years since they terminated the contract with us, and literally the day they terminated the contract with us, they said that within 2 weeks, this is back in January 2020, they said they were going to announce a tender within 2 weeks. Here we are, no tender has ever been announced. And in fact, Garibashvili didn't announce a tender yesterday. He announced a bizarre scheme, which nobody really understands and which is very obscure. The most rational path for Georgia to pursue is the one that we proposed to them all through the fall of 2019 so that they wouldn't terminate the agreement. And then after they terminated the agreement, we continued to propose this. And then even after we filed the arbitration case, we continued to propose this, which is the following, that ADC invested $75 million in the project. That is confirmed by the Ministry of Economy already, audited numbers that the Ministry of Economy confirmed. That $75 million investment is worth something to a new investor. The port was dredged, the berm was built up, and in fact, we know that the government, in talking to investors, is selling or advertising the project by saying that this work has already been done. So the rational path forward is for us, the government, and a new investor to work together on structuring the new investor's investment in the project to include the purchase of our existing interest in the project. And that purchase could either be in cash, if they don't want to have ADC as a partner in the project, or it could be a minority share in the project. And among the different very reputable international investors that we spoke to, and the government knows who they are because we had discussions with them even after we filed the arbitration case about this, there were some investors who said, yes, well, a minority interest might be okay. There were some who may have preferred a buyout. If you want to, we can discuss why I think it's likely that ADC would be a minority shareholder or would exit the project entirely. But the point of it is that we thoroughly accept the idea that the project likely must have a new majority investor, and ADC's interest will either be bought out by that investor, not by the state, will either be bought out by that investor, or that investor we would structure the transaction so that we have a minority stake. And by the way, that kind of transaction can be done either through essentially a direct transaction with a new investor, or it could be done by a tender where the accommodation of ADC's interest would be built into the tender. And this whole problem could go away. And they have had that opportunity on their desk for more than 3 years, since before they terminated the agreement, and they have refused to go for that rational solution. I would say that there was a senior representative of the government, a minister, who conducted negotiations with us after some of Georgia's foreign partners essentially pressured the government to try to solve this problem. They did conduct negotiations with us at a very senior level, and I can't give details of those discussions, but this was exactly the kind of structure that was discussed. Unfortunately, the government cut off those discussions. And I want to make one last point. Maybe you were going to ask a question about it. Garibashvili yesterday was jumping up and down and screaming practically about saying that ADC was demanding $1.5 billion. Actually, he keeps saying Hazaradze and Japaridze, which of course it's not, it's ADC. Was demanding in the arbitration $1.5 billion in damage, and all they want to do is steal money from the state. He knows that's a lie. The only thing that we want to do, and the only thing that we have ever wanted to do, is to build this project. And there is a very long written record, and there is a very long record of our conduct, which proves that we filed the arbitration case only as a last resort. We filed it only to protect our legal interests. The purpose of the arbitration case is not in any way to take any money from the Georgian government, because we know that means taking it from teachers and policemen and the army, who are already underpaid and badly treated in this government. No, what we would do is essentially, as I said, our interest, our stake would be taken care of by the structuring of the project, not by any cash payment from the Georgian government. The Georgian government wouldn't pay one tetri in order to settle out this case if it wants to.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.